standing outside the Labuan War Cemetery, and I feel very much as I did 4 years ago, standing outside the Sandakan Memorial Park. In each case, it had been a long and somewhat tortuous journey to get there, and I feel relieved merely to have made it. It was 4 years ago that I set out to relate the story of the Sandakan prisoners of war, the extermination of whom was one of the great atrocities of World War II. And I followed the route of the so-called Ranau death marches, following in the tracks of the ever-dwindling number of survivors down as far as Lost Camp, where the last of them were murdered, indeed after the end of the Second World War. I wasn't, however, able to make the additional step of going to their final resting place because of the COVID movement control orders. I said at that time I thought it was unfinished business, and I vowed to come back one day to complete the final step, and this I've now achieved. I recounted the main events in the last video of the series, and after the Second World War, the Australian War Graves Unit made a concerted effort to recover the remains of the Sandakan PoWs, and in this they were remarkably successful, recovering total 2163 sets of remains out of 2428 known to have died. Now initially these were buried in a war cemetery on the site of the Sandakan camp, and this was opened on Anzac Day 1947. But the site was found to be unsuitable, subject to frequent waterloggings, and the decision was taken to exhume the remains for final burial here on Labuan Island. And this happened in 1949. I show here the official register listing those who were buried here. And this includes not only the Sandakan PoWs, but others who died here in Labuan, nearby Brunei, and in various parts of Borneo. And there's very nearly 4,000 of them. But in addition to that, there's the Labuan Memorial, which lists those who are known to have died but who have no known grave. And those are listed on these panels around here. And there's very nearly 3,000 of them, a huge total. I've been to a number of different war cemeteries in various parts of the world, including some very famous ones. The Labuan War Cemetery shares exactly the same quiet dignity as the others, and this is something that Britain and the Commonwealth countries do uniquely well. Other countries, such as Russia and Japan, seem to do very little to commemorate their war dead. The Labuan War Cemetery has a couple of unusual features. Firstly, more than 50% of the graves are unmarked. And the reason for this is that the Japanese destroyed all documents relating to prisoners of war at the end of the Second World War, in case they could be used in war crimes trials against them. And secondly, the cemetery isn't on the site of a major battlefield or even in a major war zone, so those who are buried here generally came from afar. Because of its remote location, the cemetery isn't widely known and isn't greatly visited, although there does seem to be a steady trickle of visitors, but not all of them appreciate the significance of the place. Now, I know it can be regarded as trite for mentioning it, but the fact is that everyone commemorated here was a real person. Everyone was someone's son, someone's friend. Many of them would have been husbands, fathers, uncles, godfathers, and they've all passed through their individual death agonies to get here. And the quantity of suffering which is represented by those commemorated here and those who knew them is absolutely unimaginable. Now, many of these guys will already have been forgotten, but they gave their lives in what was ultimately a successful cause. It's been 4 years since I first tried to get here, and that's a significant chunk out of my remaining life. But for the fallen here, it's absolutely nothing. They'll be here forever. Now, I know this video isn't going to attract a huge number of views, but if it does anything to preserve the memory of these brave men, it will still have been worth it. Since I'm actually in Labuan, I will go over to Surrender Point. This is one of the very beautiful locations in the world overlooking South China Sea. But the beauty of the place completely belies the solemnity of events which took place here almost 80 years ago. And that was the surrender of the Japanese forces in this theatre of the Second World War. And the timetable of events: on the 15th of August 1945, Japan formally announced its unconditional surrender in a broadcast made by Emperor Hirohito. And the instrument of surrender was signed in Tokyo Harbour on the 2nd of September. And on the 10th of September, Lieutenant General Baba, the Japanese 37th Army, formally surrendered to Major General George Wotton of the Australian 9th Division, surrendering his sword also. And the same thing occurred 2 days later in Singapore, the surrender being taken by Lord Louis Mountbatten. Now, since I'm here, I will briefly cover the Japanese Peace Park, which is at Surrender Point. The Japanese government has never accepted that they were the aggressors in World War II, that any war crimes were ever committed, or that they ever had any culpability for the terrible events which took place. However, they did open a number of these peace parks at various historical war sites as some sort of commemoration. To me, they're a fairly empty gesture, although they are quite nice places to spend a bit of time. This particular one has architecture which I admit I don't fully understand.